Cambridge University Russian Society continues our great tradition of inviting prominent speakers, and today we have Ruslan Dzarasov, who is Doctor of Economics. He's Senior Research Fellow at the Central Economics and Mathematics Institute of Russian Academy of Sciences, and also he works in the Laboratory of Market Economy in the Moscow State University. And today he will present his new book, The Conundrum of the Russian Capitalism.
Dear colleagues, I'm glad to be here today, and I'm honored to give this lecture here in famous Cambridge University, all the more that it is well known with the Keynesian School of Economics, and today Cambridge is one of the major places, great place where post-Keynesian economics is developing. I would like to start with a few more words about myself. I graduated from Moscow State University in 1985 and obtained a candidate of economics diploma in Moscow State University in 1992. Then in 2008, PhD in post-Keynesian economics here in UK at Staffordshire University. And a few years later, I defended my doctorate in Moscow State University. And now I have a job in Central Economics and Mathematics Institute in Moscow. So I should say that I belong to the generation which have a certain experience of living under the Soviet power and then witnessing the change to capitalism, radical market reforms of the 1990s, and maybe it is the reason why I'm trying to understand the nature of modern Russian capitalism. It is the prime object of my research activities. And I should say that I witnessed the enormous aspirations which were raised by, and expectations of common people in Russia, which were raised by our shift to capitalism from Soviet society. And at the same time, I witnessed the enormous disillusionment which people experienced a few years later. On the eve of market reforms in Russia, famous Russian TV journalist Vladimir Pozner organized a talk show with a suggestive title, "Do We Need Capitalism?" This broadcast was seen as a triumph for liberals over the supposedly backward and limited opponents of the new social system. Highly regarded Russian economist of the time, Stanislav Shatalin, from my institution, academician from my institution, he gave the essence of new truthful doctrine to viewers of this broadcast in a very straightforward and popular fashion. Imagine a small pie divided in equal pieces. That is socialism. Now imagine much bigger pie and better pie divided on unequal pieces, but even small pieces of the second pie are much bigger than equal pieces of the first. That is capitalism. Another guest of the broadcast explained the easy way to reach this consumering paradise. The state should get out of economy. Just as simple as that. No reservations, no classical, on the one hand, on the other hand, which economists so like, nothing. This was a very easy recipe which was suggested to cure all the illnesses of our economy of the time. During the same period, Russian television demonstrated an advertisement informing viewers about the democratic purposes of the radical market reforms. It was shown a map of Russia covered with smoking factory chimneys and electricity transmission lines. For the benefit of dim-witted, the voiceover explained, "Look, this is the total wealth of Russia, совокупное достояние России." Then a piece was cut off the factory, and the voice explained, "And this is your personal piece of this wealth." After that, this piece of factory was transformed into a voucher, flew in the air, and obediently alighted in the hand of some anxious Russian. And the voiceover asked, "What will you do with the voucher?" And the anxious, bewildered Russian proceeded energetically scratching his head. In the same broadcast which I described above, Vladimir Posner explained the enormous significance of vouchers and privatization in our life. In our lives, he explained, if you have 3 people in your family, then you have 3 vouchers. It is a chance for you to start your own business. Put your family together. Discuss where to invest your vouchers. Remember, that moment you decide your own future, the future of your children, the future of your grandchildren. This is the great opportunity which is provided to you by democracy. His words about deciding our future were the only morsel of truth in these and numerous other broadcasts on the same topic. And Russians believed wholeheartedly in all this propaganda, I would say. However, not long time later, Russians witnessed enormous decline of production, collapse of living standards, ruining of educational and health care system in our country, and reducing Russia to a semi-dependent state. The collapse of hopes which Russians held to capitalism has a significance that extends well beyond Russia and its people. Now there are growing a number of studies which prove that not only former Soviet republics, but the whole former Eastern Bloc is reduced to a periphery or semi-periphery of Western Europe. And this is the main conundrum of Russian capitalism. Why it failed the hopes and aspirations of Russian people? I believe that seeking the answer to this question, one needs to turn to the genesis of Russian capitalism. But one must consider this question in wider frameworks of the world capitalist system. From my standpoint, there are 2 major formative factors which determine the nature of the new social order in Russia. Firstly, it is degeneration of the Stalinist bureaucracy in Soviet times. And secondly, it is the impact of the modern global financialized capitalism. Let's start from the first. By the way, on this picture you can see the recognizable image of so-called Moscow City, such district of American-style skyscrapers in the center of Moscow. But this image has another connotation, because it is well known that enormous financial fraud and embezzlement of private and public money happened at this construction site. So it demonstrates the aspirations of and pretense of Russian capitalism, and at the same time its miserable failure. I think that in Soviet times, under the surface of an ostensibly monolithic planned economic system, processes were taking place which were to have significant long-term consequences for the whole socialist world. The rapid economic growth of the Soviet Union in 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s produced radical change in the social structure of Russian society, making it much more complex and diverse in its social interests. With the expansion of rights of control over material resources, finance played only a secondary role in the Soviet central planning. The heads of state enterprises and their associates obtained both greater pecuniary and non-pecuniary privileges. And which is even more important, they, especially in Brezhnev-Gorbachev's time, they enjoyed increasing control, informal control over economic resources, which allowed them to increase, in fact, private appropriation on the basis of state property. Together with the shadow economy's growth, this created foundations for the development of private interests and private income generation based on manipulation of the public property. But it is important to note that despite the private nature of appropriating incomes from these activities, they were not essentially entrepreneurial, even in the shadow sector, because they were not based on private ownership. They were based on administrative power and on bureaucracy's command over economic resources. So the costs of these activities were nationalized, and the burden of these costs were taken on by society, but only private benefits were appropriated by bureaucracy. For many years, the centralized organs of administration had succeeded more or less in controlling the economy, but their role had gradually been undermined by growing administrative group and private interests of different groups of bureaucracy, including enterprise directors, ministry apparatus, and the like. Gradually, they increased their influence at the expense of central planning and at the expense of the control on the part of central bodies. Look, Cambridge University professor David Wayne, in his book, which I highly recommend, explained that the disadvantage of many works on transformation of economy in Russia and former Soviet Union suffer from the fact that they ignore the key question of social forces behind the reforms. And by the way, David Wayne is present here today. He develops the idea that in transition of Soviet system to capitalism, two very important social groups played their role. The administrative class, consisting of people who exercised bureaucratic control over production, education, and science, and the appropriating class, made up of the intelligentsia, who had an interest in using market mechanisms as a way to benefit from their professional knowledge. I would add to these two categories of population black market entrepreneurs who had gradually developed within the pores of the Soviet system. Thus, one may say that behind the facade of an outwardly monolithic planned economic system, the basis emerged for the development of private appropriation on foundations of collectively owned property. And these contradictions, which was inherent in the Soviet system, they broke out in the course of Gorbachev's perestroika, when real democracy was introduced and the punishment, ideological and political criminal punishment for adhering to bourgeois ideology was removed from Soviet society. And in these conditions, paradoxically and unexpectedly for the majority of Soviet population, including me, the powerful pro-capitalist bloc appeared in the Soviet Union, which consisted of administrative appropriating class and of criminal underworld. And this bloc promoted the agenda of capitalist reforms in their extreme form. But to realize why this bloc decided to move to capitalism and why the particular form of big business which we witness now in Russia appeared, one needs to turn to another very important influence and factor which influenced market transition in our country, and that is global capitalism. From the times of the classical work of Adolf Barrow and Gardner Means, The Modern Corporation and Private Property in 1932, it was assumed that American typical corporation is based on a certain separation of ownership and control. And such very interesting author, the leading post-Keynesian economist of the United States of the 1970s, 1980s, as Alfred Eichner, developed a very comprehensive model of modern corporation, which he called megacorporation, a typical corporation of American manufacturing sector. And he maintained that this separation of ownership and control was the most important institutional precondition for long-term growth maximization on the part of this megacorporation. This assumed that in golden age of capitalism, after Second World War capitalism of late 1940s, early 1970s, the megacorp was capable to pay reasonable wages, at the same time big dividends, to pay high taxes to government contributing to the social welfare system, and at the same time make reasonable investments in developing productive capacities and constantly modernizing technological level of American manufacturing. All this changed in the early and middle 1970s with the appearance of stagflation, inflation and stagnation at the same time. Private profits in corporate sector declined and the revolution of shareholders was started. Now you can see at this interesting graph the results of shareholder revolution. The diagram shows the relation of financial assets and real assets in the structure of American non-financial corporate sector. And you can see that up to the 1980s, in the structure of corporate capital in the United States, the productive capacities dominated, while then the share of financial assets started growing increasingly, and before the crisis it reached absurd level exceeding 100%. This means that now in non-financial corporate sector of the United States, financial assets, the share of financial assets exceeds the share of productive capacities in the structure of capital. This is a very important dimension of financialization. This means that the result of shareholder revolution was subjugation of management to shareholders, and the maximization of shareholder value succeeded and replaced long-term growth maximization as the main objective of American corporation. It is the triumph of Wall Street over the Main Street. And this had enormous consequences both for American and for the world capitalism, and it even affected greatly Russian radical economic reforms. American historical geographer David Harvey, in his penetrating analysis of the modern capitalism, suggested such notion as accumulation by dispossession as the feature of financialized capitalism. This means that financialization, in contrast with entrepreneurial activities of the previous time, of industrial capital, it adds to normal entrepreneurial profits such sources of profit as the wealth and value created beyond the capitalist sector, for instance, by peasantry, by the world peasantry. And it also enables big capital to appropriate some part of labor incomes which were paid to workers as wages, and then through different means they were again appropriated by big capital. This is the advantage of financialized capitalism. Now, the interesting and paradoxical event of the radical market reforms is that the degeneration of the Soviet bureaucracy and its movement to private appropriation on the basis of informal relations in the Soviet system, it appeared to be inveighing with the interests, with the values of modern financialized capitalism. These relationships, which were in Soviet time limited by the communist ideology and planning system and by law enforcing agencies, they were legalized in course of privatization in Russia. Here you can see images of yes, you can see some images of the 1990s in Russia. McDonald's, which with lots of people staying in long lines to participate in consumer and capitalism. So-called young reformers, mlado reformatori, and of course the leading figures of Russian reforms, Mr. Yeltsin and American president of the time. In course of radical market reforms of the early 1990s, not only Russia but all former Soviet republics experienced deep transformation of their economies. In course of these reforms, industrial share in total value added in the economies of the CIS countries declined on average from 38 to 29%. At the same time, the share of the raw extractive industries in the industrial value added greatly increased, and the tendency to simplification and primitivization of industrial development happened and was very salient in development of the CIS countries. It can be interpreted as structural adjustment of their economies to their new position in the world economy. Such a conclusion can be further substantiated by the major trends in the foreign trade of the CIS countries. You can see here on this figure the main products which Commonwealth exports to the rest of the world. And you can see that the overwhelming part of our export is comprised of mineral products and wood, pulp and paper products. In other words, of the products with low value added. If you take the import from the rest of the world to our countries, you will see quite the opposite picture. We are importing mainly the products of manufacturing, machinery equipment, transport equipment, products of chemical industry, and even foodstuffs. This means that the CIS countries export products with low degree of processing and imports the products with high degree of processing. It is the obvious structure of foreign trade over colonial and dependent countries. We export on such a scale that, look, we have active balance of foreign trade. Net exports from our countries is great and growing. Net export means export minus imports. And the balance is very positive. This means that a large portion of resources of our countries is moved abroad. You may say that we earn foreign currency, which is very good for our economies. You would be correct if these revenues would be used to develop our own economies. Unfortunately, it is not the case. Russia is a salient example. Look at this table. Net export from Russia in the 2000s oscillated around enormous figure of 10% of GDP. Yes, this produced enormous inflow of foreign currency in our country. But look at the last two indicators in this table. You can see that Russia, during all this period, was net exporter of capital abroad. Pay attention to 2006 and 2007, when private sector became a net borrower of foreign capital. These years, government sector greatly increased its export of capital. On the whole, Russia all these years was net exporter of capital. This is capital flight from our country. It is only natural that economies which are bleeding for many years, they experienced decline of real wages. Look at this table. Here you can see that official statistics of wages gives misleading picture. Look, the first bar is real wages calculated on consumer price index, but this index is misleading because it includes luxury goods which workers do not buy. If you recalculate the real wages in our countries basing on the bundle of food products, the prime articles of consumption by workers, you will see a very different picture that nowhere in the former Soviet Union the real wages regained the Soviet level. At the same time, productivity greatly outperforms the dynamics of real wages. And Russia became an exemplar case of social inequality. If you turn to the last Global Wealth Report of 2013, then you will see that Russia has the highest level of wealth inequality. Worldwide, there is one billionaire for every $170 billion in household wealth. In Russia, we have one billionaire for every $11 billion. Worldwide, billionaires collectively account only for 1–2% of total household wealth, while in Russia today, 110 billionaires own 35% of all wealth. If you take the results of capitalist reforms in whole for all former Soviet republics, then you will see enormous human price of radical market reforms. On this picture, you can see the relative position of USSR and all independent states in the world. On the vertical axis, you have per capita GNP rank in the world. And on horizontal axis, you have a Human Development Index rank. You can see that after more than 20 years of radical market reforms, not a single former Soviet republic, including the Baltic states, comes close to the position occupied once by USSR. And Russia fares a little better than some other countries, but I think it is only because only due to the fact that Russia is rich by oil, gas and other natural resources. Of course, some countries fare much worse, for instance, Tajikistan. But Tajikistan is a country which is going through the tragedy of civil war, ferocious civil war and civil conflicts, and it is a very weak consolation that we are a bit better. I think that from the above, one can see that economies of the CIS countries moved to simplified production structures with declined manufacturing and grown extractive industries, which make them fit to become suppliers of products with a low degree of processing to the developed world. At the same time, these societies experienced deep social transformation, creating on the one pole reserve army of cheap labor and on the other comprador possessing classes. It is nothing else than development of underdevelopment. And all these features of periphery capitalism, they affected and they are reflected in the Russian model of corporate governance. Look at these intelligent faces. You know, at the beginning of the 1990s, a book appeared in Russia, which was called Adam Smith Walks Through Moscow. It was an interesting book because it gave in a concise form the recommendations of Western advisors in all Eastern Bloc countries. There was some fictitious prime minister from Eastern Europe who would ask silly questions to some generalized Western advisor on different aspects of economic reforms. And it all was based on a huge list of publications about the transition processes. And there is such a dialogue there that Prime Minister asks the Western advisor, you recommend privatization, but look, our society is very criminalized. If we start privatization in such quick periods which you advise us, then criminals will take over large parts of the economy. And the Western advisor answers, find the corresponding page of Adam Smith and let the invisible hand redistribute property. So, we, 150 million Russians, closed our eyes and let the invisible hand redistribute property. And when we opened our eyes, we didn't recognize our country. We saw these people, new masters of Mother Russia. And I think that the twist which was inherent to the privatization programs and to all this propaganda that private property automatically produces economic efficiency, which automatically produces high living standards, was that in fact it omitted what is the dark side of big business worldwide, not only in Russia. And I think that it is increasing move of big business to very authoritarian patterns. And Russia is a salient example of these processes. I think that the essence of specific Russian model of corporate governance is in the infrastructure of control. From my standpoint, Russian enterprises are controlled by some dominant groups which legalized or which increased, I would better say, their informal control over the resources. And this was embedded in the whole infrastructure of control. I mean under this term as a network, a set of formal, sometimes, but predominantly informal institutions which secure control of the dominant groups over enterprises. In the infrastructure of control, you can single out the external and the internal elements. The external elements include chains of ownership. One specialist calls these offshore clouds. In Russia, maybe it is the only country in the world where more than 90% of business is registered in offshore sites. And enormous capital flight happens through offshore chains of offshore firms. And these offshore firms play double role. On the one hand, they obscure the real owners of Russian enterprises, help to disguise them. On the other hand, they provide solid ways to extract financial flows and to withdraw funds abroad. So it is a very important part of the external infrastructure of control. But it will never work if you fail to establish very close links with governmental officials. You have to be represented in government bodies by some important functionaries who will help to defend your business, your property rights. External defense of property rights includes direct links with law enforcing agencies, with private security firms, and even with organized criminal structures. All this is very expensive because these strong people in government and law enforcing agencies, they need to be paid, and the prices are high. But the stakes are high as well in Russian big business. But it is not enough to establish close links with the state and different external groups of enforcement. Russian big business develops very elaborate institutions which control the enterprises themselves. And these internal elements of infrastructure of control include or assume great centralization of decision-making process. This centralization in Russian corporations exceeds the norms and the reasonable needs of rational business. Russian enterprises develop monitoring and auditing bodies and processes. Everything should be controlled. And at the same time, they develop big internal security services. I don't know exactly the current figure, but a few years ago it was said that it was calculated that about 800,000 people work in Russia in private security agencies and departments at firms. And all these people are well paid, while, for instance, officers in the army and officers in militia who protect ordinary people, they are underpaid. The main aim of internal elements of infrastructure of control is to secure the dominant position of strong people. Who are these strong people? Very often in Russia you can't say exactly, just studying the official documents of a firm, who is in control here. Because the real dominating people who are the final beneficiaries of this offshore chain of firms, they may be formally have no any connections and no any relation to real enterprises. Very often the final eventual beneficiary is some high government functionary. Sometimes it is some criminal tycoon, so-called вор в законе. I don't know how to translate it in Russian, in English. Leader of the criminal group. Sometimes it is the general executive who formally is only a hired man, just like workers. But in fact, all people who are represented in the board of directors represent the offshore firms which eventually are established by this general executive. To avoid this confusion of legal and real position of the dominant groups in Russian enterprises, I use the word insider, big insider, which I draw from Western corporate governance theory. Insider is somebody some stakeholder who is in a position to influence corporate governance. Outsider is a stakeholder who has no such influence. So in Russia, small group of big insiders with different legal status can control this particular enterprise. And it is impossible to implement the formal property rights in Russia if your formal rights are not backed by informal control, by this infrastructure. So The infrastructure of control is a very important precondition for dominating over Russian enterprises, but it creates vulnerability at the same time, because since infrastructure of control is based predominantly on informal institutions, it is impossible to legalize, to bequeath to your inheritors this position. But at the same time, it is always possible to challenge it. And the waves of redistribution of property rights regularly sweep over Russian economy, either in the forms of criminal raiding or in the forms of quasi-nationalization. Criminal raiding in Russia in 1990s and even in 2000s became a big industry of the national economy, with its own market of services, with prices on these services, how to take over some other people's business, and with enormous turnover of capital, which amounts to tens of billions of dollars annually. Quasi-nationalization, when government organizes so-called state corporations, is in fact another form of redistribution of property, because in fact these state corporations, they nationalize only costs of production and economic activities, but enormous embezzlement of state money in these corporations means that private appropriation dominates these organizations. So, dominant position in Russian big business is very unstable, it is vulnerable, and due to this, it is fundamentally unstable. This fundamental instability of the position of big insiders stems not from some limitations put on society by probability of communists taking power or some political turmoil. No. And the current Russian state is organizing quasi-nationalization only plays the game which was started by capitalists themselves. In fact, this struggle for redistribution of property rights in the ranks of Russian big businessmen is encroachment on your business by your class comrades. They use the state as their instrument, but it is the instrument not of planning like in Soviet times. It is an instrument of redistribution of economic interests in favor of some private groups of people. This instability conditions short-term time orientation of Russian big business. This is very important because short-termism puts powerful limitations on organization of business activities, and it defines the dominating type of income which is appropriated in Russian big business. I call this type of income insider rent. Under this term, I mean income which is derived from control over the firm's financial flows. It should be distinguished from normal entrepreneurial profits. Look at this scheme. Here I tried to demonstrate the specifics of insider rent as an income appropriation. One of the most popular ways to extract insider rent is to establish ostensibly independent trade house. Some group of big insiders owns enterprises. The same people establish trade house, of course, in some offshore site. Then they sell products of their enterprises to this trade house on prices less than market level. The trade house resells these products on market prices and obtains profits. These profits are withdrawn to some offshore figurehead companies, one-day companies, which will soon disappear with their financial documentation, of course. From these offshore figurehead companies, cash is withdrawn to private accounts of the members of this dominant group. Then, of course, it happens in offshore sites. Then this money partially reinvested in Russian enterprises, but now they come as foreign capital, foreign investments, or foreign loans. And the other part is saved and invested mainly in Western, mainly in American financial markets. This is the way of withdrawing funds from Russian enterprises. You can see that that this type of income is very different from entrepreneurial profit, as we know, as it is described in standard neoclassical textbooks or in such theories as Max Weber's theory of Protestant ethics and thrift. The most important feature of this type of income is that it is short-term and that it is based on extra economic coercion, because infrastructure of control described above is the major precondition for insider rent extraction. And this infrastructure of control is obviously non-economic, violent instrument which reflects the relative power of big business relative to other social groups involved in production. So this income is only partially has the features of entrepreneurial activities. On the other hand, it is very close to feudal rent extracted in previous times from labor of peasantry due to extra economic coercion. This dual nature of insider rent reflects the dual genesis, historical genesis of Russian capitalism. On the one hand, it is the result of the influence of Western financialized capitalism. On the other hand, it is conditioned by degeneration of Stalinist bureaucracy. So this feudal element comes from power of bureaucracy. This entrepreneurial element comes from moving to capitalism. But in fact, you can see that insider rent as an income extracted from control over financial flows has similar features with the incomes of modern financialized capitalist corporations, which also gain major part of their incomes not from entrepreneurial activities now, but from financial speculations, and these incomes in financial sphere, as it was said, are based on accumulation by dispossession. Obviously, Russian insider rent is a kind of accumulation by dispossession in our country, with the specifics conditioned by semi-peripheral state of modern Russia. Now, you can realize that such kind of income as insider rent is obtained by big insiders due to reduction of wage fund, due to reduction of salaries of rank and file managers, due to reduction of dividends, due to reduction of investment funds, and due to all other sources of financial flows which are imaginable. Of course, if the big insiders are especially myopic and especially short-term oriented, they will tend to appropriate more financial flows as a private income. If they are middle-term oriented, then they will leave something to finance investment. But you can hardly find in big business of such type, which I describe, long-term growth maximizers. And this engenders a number of social conflicts at Russian enterprises. Minority shareholders usually do not have any sound dividends. In result, Russian security market equity market, it failed to become a sound source of investment funds for Russian corporations. Equities, securities of Russian enterprises normally are undervalued because investors subtract inside the rent extraction from the value of these securities. Rank and file managers are heavily underpaid, and in response they try to appropriate some additional incomes, illegal incomes from the firms at which they have their jobs. And they organize theft, they try to embezzle some money, they try to confuse owners and involve them in some unproductive investments which create opportunities to embezzle money. And sometimes they even establish their own figurehead companies in order to appropriate some parts of financial flows of the firms where they work. Hired labor, unfortunately, it is of course heavily underpaid, but only very seldom modern Russian workers try to organize in independent trade unions and collectively oppose their owners. Most often they practice one or other kind of so-called opportunistic behavior. In fact, it is theft, or they can, for example, produce some products using the firm's equipment, but in their to their private benefit, and to sell it on the market or something like that. But theft is the most widespread response of modern Russian worker to violation of his rights. Thus, Russian enterprise is torn apart by enormous social conflicts. These conflicts are suppressed by increasing infrastructure of control. That's why big insiders need centralization of decision making, increasing and developing monitoring and auditing procedures, and expanding their internal security departments. Thus, we may say that modern Russian big business has very authoritarian nature. It can be derived that Russian capitalist elite has very predatory nature and enrich itself largely through violence, fraud, and embezzlement. And of course, this withdrawal of funds and increasing investments in infrastructure of control, increasing theft and damage coming from opportunistic behavior of hired labor and rank and file managers. All this diminishes the opportunities to develop real sound business in Russia, and it undermines accumulation of capital and investment strategies. The type of investment which dominates Russian economy I would call inferior. At this picture you can see the results of under-accumulation of capital. It is the results of a disaster at Sayano-Shushenskaya powerhouse, which was underinvested, and this led to one of the greatest technical catastrophes in the history of Russian industry. Look, at this picture you can see that private and public investments in fixed capital in Russia, compared to 1990, never restored the pre-reform level. It declined in 1990s by 5 times. In course of 2000s, investments grew, but even today they reach only 3/4 of its Soviet level. Now look here. The share, here I present some results of surveys of Russian managers. You can see at this figure that the share of enterprises abstaining from any investments at all is very great in Russia. It's oscillating between 20% and more than 50%. And even today it is about one half of Russian enterprises do not invest anything in productive capacities. And the quality of investments is also very important. Here you can see the results of a survey where the question was asked whether the current level of investment in your enterprise secures the necessary modernization. And you can see that the share of a positive response is always very small in Russia. Even today, we have the best position from this standpoint, but still only less than 1/5 of Russian enterprises implement investments which managers consider as sound. In the end of 2012, investment of more than 80% of enterprises was insufficient for maintaining the current level of production and capable of securing only partial improvements or only to maintain their productive capacities. This I mean under inferior investment. And the reason is that Russian enterprises find so-called cheap versions of investment in productive capacities. Cheap investments means that they try to avoid constructing new productive sites. They do not invest in up-to-date equipment. They do not introduce last technologies. And the strategies which are used by Russian enterprises allow them to decrease the costs of investments by 2 or 3 times. But the price is growing obsoleteness of Russian productive capacities. The price is installing second-hand equipment and technological degeneration of our industry. The figures which reflect the average longevity of Russian industrial equipment are staggering. In Soviet times, the average longevity gradually grew from 8 years at the beginning of 1980s to 11 years at the beginning of 1990s. But in course of radical market reforms, this figure obtained simply absurd levels. And now the average longevity of equipment in the Russian industry reached 23, 24 years. And the share of machines and equipment exceeding 20 years, or absolutely wear and tear, amounts to 68% of the whole stock. It is a very unfavorable and tragic situation, decline, in fact, of Russian industry. So it is empirical fact that after 20 years of radical market reforms, investments of Russian companies are insufficient neither to arrest the shrinking of the fixed capital stock, nor to stop its technological degeneration. I would like to give you a brief example of such very ferocious struggle of big insiders over for the control of an enterprise. Probably you heard about the Volgogradsky Khimprom. It was one of the best enterprises of Russian chemical industry. Once it was the biggest in Europe. But in 1990s, enormous struggle for control over this enterprise started. I can't go into details, we don't have time for this, but this scheme reflects different groups of big insiders who faced each other in struggle for control over this enterprise. In the second part of the figure, you can see offshore firms which disguise the real big insiders challenging the control over the enterprise. Every group which temporarily seized control over Volgogradsky Khimprom established trade houses which will resell the products of the corporation on undervalued prices. So everybody tried to gain money from it. And officials from Mingosимущества, Ministry of State Ownership, they had controlling a share of equities of this enterprise. And from time to time, they would sell part of it to some rival group to support them, but then they will obtain money from their rivals and organize things in such a way that they resell this, the same shares to their rivals. So they constantly enrich themselves. But big insiders who temporarily took over the enterprise, they also enriched themselves because they, every group started withdrawing funds with new energy and criticizing the previous owners as inefficient, fraudulent, and criminal, to be replaced in half a year by another group who would criticize and disclose information about these owners. In result of all this, since they failed to establish any genuine control over enterprise and to put things in order, the opportunistic behavior of rank-and-file managers flourished there. And they established lots of different figurehead companies which tried to embezzle some small portions of financial flows of this enterprise. So, in fact, it was nearly ruined. You can see, at this scheme, you can see how two groups of big insiders challenged each other in chemical industry. It's a very interesting story with lots of criminal raiding, using law enforcing agencies against each other, but I can't go into these details now. Here you can see how the financial position of the enterprise declined. The last indicator demonstrates the profits, net profits of this enterprise, and it made losses because so many funds were withdrawn. And in result, the fixed capital stock, the productive capacities of this enterprise became very obsolete, and wear and tear of fixed assets in whole amounted to 80%. This means that this enterprise actually it came to the brink of just disappearance. So I think that the clue to the conundrum of Russian capitalism is its model of corporate governance, which is very authoritarian, which is short-term oriented, which is inefficient in terms of investments and accumulation of funds. And this reflects both the history of Russian capitalism. This reflects the arbitrary, I think that arbitrary power of Russian oligarchs. It inherited the arbitrary power of Stalinist bureaucracy. But on the other hand, it embraced the values of modern capitalism, not of the capitalism of Weberian Protestant ethics, but the values of modern financialized capitalism. And in result, it produced this highly inefficient system of big business. These are main ideas of my vision of Russian capitalism, and those who are interested, they can read more on this subject and on my model of Russian capitalism in this new book, which you can see here. And those who may be happened to be in London on Monday, they can participate in the book launch in Houseman's bookshop. Information about the time and conditions is over there. I would be glad to see everybody of you at this event. Now,
Thank you very much.